So when you don't travel to a country so often, you basically forge an opinion on the country because of the friends you have. That's good. That's good. But also what you see in newspapers. You know, I'm reading the Financial Times more or less every day, and I tend to believe what they say about the US and what they say about China and what they say about Poland. And my perception of Poland was that it's a country that was perhaps not so much committed to being green. You know, you see what I mean? And so the first shock, and the reason I'm so pleased, among other reasons, to be here today, is the great presentation by Jaroslav that we heard before on the plans for a greener industry in Poland. I think this is a first shock and a great news for me. And also, Marcin, the fact that, you know, the UN and the ITU and the Sustainable Development Goals are being given such a prominence in the program is perhaps another surprise for me, you know. And of course, it makes all sense. You guys are business people. This is not, you know, listening to Jaroslav for a few seconds, I thought I was listening to a Greenpeace presentation, but actually not, you know. It's all about good business. It's all about good business. We live increasingly in an interconnected world. So if you want to save your country, you need to save the planet. If you want to keep the virus out, you need to have a global view of the problem. The focus on Africa that Doreen alluded to is also something which is very close to our problems in Europe. You know, Africa will soon be a couple of billion people. Some countries, there's various degrees, have a certain degree of tolerance for migrations. You know, your neighbors, the Germans, have been pretty generous in the recent past. But, you know, our public opinion, with various sensitivities, will not accept billions. You know, so I think we have a vested interest in Poland, in Belgium, my little country, in Europe in general, to care about the problems of the world, because sooner or later they become our problems. So when I think of it, you know, these topics are absolutely central to any gathering of business people, whether it's in Poland or in any country of the world. I'm deeply convinced, you know, that Europe has a huge role to play. Europe is an economic giant. Unfortunately, too often it's a political. Its economic weight is not matched by its political weight. Alors, we see it in the Middle East with the problems, and we collect the problems, but we don't do anything to solve it. And I hope we won't see it with the environment, but I think Europe should do more to help Poland overcome its dependency to coal. We should probably do more to help the Brazilian keep the Amazon together. Anyway, that's just to set the scene. Let's now move to the topic of this session, which is around connectivity. And I'd like to quote what Doreen said, not in this speech, but in the one she gave earlier this morning, when she said that there cannot be any SDGs without connectivity, without ICT. And of course, connectivity is only one part of a bigger jigsaw. Perhaps at the end of the session, if we have a bit of time, we can talk about the other piece of the jigsaw, because connectivity is basically what will enable us to collect the data from IoTs and other ways of collecting data. But with those data, we will have to exploit this data in the cloud with AI, with big data and so on, which will raise a number of problems which perhaps we can discuss. But in this session, we'll focus on connectivity. And there, Marcin, perhaps to start with a rather broad question, but one which I keep asking myself. So, you know, I'm going to ask all the questions I never dare to ask this morning. and which I've been wondering for years, is what is the problem? Normally in a market, in a market, when there is a demand, there is a supply matching it, So whenever we talked about 5G, fiber to the home, I have a bit this feeling that on the one hand we have government and manufacturers saying, we need it. We have consumers and perhaps many businesses wondering what the hell are we going to do with that? And operators sitting on the fence saying, yeah, we need it, but we'd like to see a bit more demand before we unleash the capex. So what is the problem? We don't have that with cars. With cars, consumers want cars, manufacturers produce cars, and there are huge capex involved in the production of cars or anything. So Marcin, what is the problem with our sector where we seem to have this problem of perhaps the chicken and the egg? We don't have a supply, so there is no demand, and there is no demand, so telcos, which at the end of the day are the one footing the bill, most of it at least. So how can we break this conundrum?
Well, I think that the problem is strictly connected with the answer to the question, who would be the most beneficial from this cross-sectoral development? And you mentioned about the Jarek Tworuk presentation that was really fruitful, and Jarek is one of our, let's say, ICT geeks who successfully insists on the movers and shakers in terms of, let's say, the common understanding that there is not only telco, but there are other branches of economy that we need to take into consideration. It's not only about the cows and chickens on the presentation and some facts and figures that are strictly behind, but it's especially about the common understanding that there is no other way than to cooperate and cross-sectoral approach. That was my first intention during the morning session and the presentation that I was trying to deliver. And this focus and vision, not only on the, let's say, national level, but especially on the Europe Broadband Commission level, that there is no other way to develop the market if we didn't take into consideration the cooperation with other industries. That's the first point. And what follows from that, you got several threats. First of all, who would be the most beneficial from such kind of cooperation? Hard tensions between the telco, for example, and banking sector, for example. It's the slight difference between the telco and ICT in this way. I mean purely computer science issues, but there is a huge amount of questions regarding how to deliver an appropriate return on assets for branches. The other issue regarding the 5G, for example, it's strictly connected with the cooperation between telco, as I mentioned this morning, industry, transport and energy. That seems to be the most beneficial flywheels for the fourth industrial revolution, but still we missed this opportunity this year to join Barcelona Congress to find out about the latest words in terms of technological development, but we know exactly what was the final outcome from the previous conference. It was that you need to guarantee a level playing field for all market players. And I can agree that some of us, even Broadband Commission, especially telco providers, are a little bit aloof in front of, facing the cooperation with the energy that is, let's say, in majority countries ruled by the governments, with the logistics that is really beneficial in terms of return on assets. But it's happening, and there is no other way than to join the club and to start looking for some opportunities and business cases. The last but not least, I think that we are working as a European markets, even European market, not one European market, but European markets. We are working in our, let's say, silos, and it's visibly divided between each EU member states. Of course, there are some projects like roaming, like interconnection relation that we need to include in our portfolio, but more or less we are a little bit aloof in front of, let's say, going outside our, let's say, comfort zone, if you know what I mean. It's rather than business, it's sometimes even psychological barrier to cooperate on the international level if you are not a member of the international intergroup, like, let's say, huge company. It's even more than challenging to open your, let's say, infrastructure or to open your cooperation for the foreign companies. That's quite difficult if you escalated that on the, let's say, global level. European Commission, UN Broadband Commission, ITU collaboration. You could see that, of course, we can meet 3-4 times per year to go through that, to think about the promotion prospects for all of us. But after that, everyone is coming back to, let's say, national playground, and it's looking for, let's say, a national level of let's say, return on assets. And it's not how it would be organized in future. If you combine it with the, let's say, US market, with the Chinese one, there are more and more influences, and it's not only about the infrastructure delivery, it's not only about the let's say, devices that are coming from Asia, or the hard tensions regarding the, let's say, 5G development with or without Chinese infrastructure. It's not how it works. It's about the, let's say, global cooperation, and the only issue is to clarify to which extent, to which level we can investigate that on, or to which level we can, let's say, release and leave it, let's say, behind the, let's say, regulatory regime.
I just wrote down strategic autonomy. That's perhaps something that we can discuss.
Yeah, that's how it works.
Just perhaps a quick comment on my side, listening to you, Marcin, about the importance of international cooperation. And I'd like to make a short personal testimony here. Because of my job, I'm lucky or unfortunate, say my wife, to have to travel around the world all the time. For next week I will be in Argentina and Brazil, but I go pretty much everywhere. And what is always, you know, we Europeans are, including myself, are pretty critical about, you know, EU law and EU law in telecom. Tomorrow afternoon I'll have a session on the code for those of you who might be interested, and you will see that I'm not very necessarily very kind with what we have achieved, but that's another matter. But outside, whenever you feel as a European a bit depressed, you know, I recommend that you take a trip anywhere, perhaps not in the US, but anywhere else. California would be fine. And then you are welcome as somebody coming from a region where regulation is balanced, where the interests of the citizens are taken into account. So whenever you feel depressed, do that. You take a trip to pretty much anywhere, and you say that you are going to come and speak about our regulatory framework, whether it's on the telecom side, even more on the data side, you know, what we have achieved in the field of privacy, what we are working on at the moment in the field of artificial intelligence, is something that the whole world, okay, not China perhaps, at least not the Chinese government, perhaps not Trump, but pretty much everybody else is looking at, not to copy, but as a source of inspiration, you know, including, by the way, in the region where Bokar comes from, the Gulf states, much to my surprise. Anyway, that was a comment.
So what would you like to copy from the US market?
Hello.
Implement to European conditions?
I think what the world wants to copy from the US market is the tremendous dynamics of Silicon Valley. That's on the data side. But this is a session about connectivity. Huh? And I'm going to make a crude short description of the US connectivity market. In the 90s, when I was young, I was reading, you know, I started my telecom career in the late 80s, and at that time there was, there was, if you wanted to do benchmarking, there was nothing in Europe, because we were all monopolists. There was the UK, which had already a duopoly, and the US had something. So, young guys like me, we were reading FCC dockets every day. And throughout the 90s, Europe and the US progressed pretty much in parallel. If you look at the 96 Telecom Act, the thing they had on local loop unbundling in the late 90s, they were pretty much what we did subsequently in Europe. And then in 2002, 2003, the US and Europe, split a bit like the Protestant and the Catholic, you may say. And we now, regulatory-wise, we believe in different religion, if you like. The US believe that wholesale regulation, is something which is an impediment to investment, And we in Europe, we have, this business of market analysis. We basically believe in a combination of service-based competition and facilitated competition, this famous theory of the investment ladder. Now, who is right? Who is right? You may say, Philippe, after so many years, let's look at the outcome and who was right. Was it the US who made the right switch 20 years ago? Is it Europe who is pursuing with this, seemingly endless layers of regulation on wholesale? The problem is, it depends what you want. It depends what you want. If you want to maximize capex, if you want to maximize capital expenditures, well, there is no doubt that the US is winning because per capita, they invest roughly twice as much as we do in Europe per capita. Now you may say, Philippe, you're comparing Apple with speed. The US, you have big cities, but outside of that, it's a huge land, much more costly to fiber to cover than small Europe. Europe is a pretty small place when you think of it, with 500 million people. So you compare, okay, but still, they spend twice as much as we do on capex per capita. Now, you may say, Philippe, I'm a consumer, I don't care about what the industry invests. What I want is the price that I pay. I'm really price conscious. But then Europeans are winning because it's a crude thing, but roughly prices in the US are twice as high as in Europe. Now, in Europe, it varies from country to country, but the order of magnitude would be that one. So what do I like in the US? It depends. It depends what you want to achieve. That's always the thing in the policy making. First of all, you need to set your objectives. Once you set the objective, you derive your policies. I would say that in Europe, we have favored intense competition. Sometimes some people could argue too much competition. It's a comment that you hear often. I know there are perhaps. I'm a French speaker, although I'm Belgian. In France, there is a lot of talk about this. There's too much competition because prices are really low. At the same time, voilà. So that's what could be said, perhaps again, in very few words.
Can I just come in here, because there is one other issue that the U.S. market is famous for, and one that comes to my mind right now is that the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, it was 1994, if I'm not mistaken, when Steve Nash was awarded with the Nobel Prize for the game theory, and in the same year the FCC was the first regulator who successfully decided to use the game theory for the infrastructure rollout and the auction for the first spectrum distribution. So that's one issue that you can find in Wikipedia about the US telco market and the spectrum issue, that it's really interesting. Right now, US is going to find some, let's say, budget money for those operators who would be reshuffled from the spectrum bandwidth, so as to release that for 5G and other providers. But what I really admire, and maybe I've heard a joke that the best with FCC is that they do not report to European Commission, and that's why they are so successful. And that's something that we are not able to avoid in Belgium or in Poland, as we need to cooperate in BEREC and to cooperate with European Commission, fulfilling or, let's say, imposed obligations on regulatory authorities in Europe. But it's completely different economy. That's what follows from, and in different penetration as well. But what is really in line with our approach is that even in US, or especially in US, you've got this, let's say, multi-sectoral approach regarding the branches of economy. Of course, they use cable industry, they use DOCSIS 3.0 as the most beneficial, let's say, fixed technology right now. The fiber is also going to be delivered by Verizon and the other operators using some more and more advanced technological solutions, but it's still, let's say, in the minority of the market shares. The majority is strictly based on the DOCSIS 3.0 or 3.1. When in terms to 5G market, something that would be, let's say, really beneficial for Polish and European market providers would be not to limit the reservations for spectrum. I mean, in Europe, in terms of, in line with COT is 15 years plus 5, if I'm not mistaken. In US, there is no limitation. In some other countries, like Korean market, is completely, if I'm not mistaken, free of charge. So that's a different reality. But coming back to this general approach you mentioned about, I think that they've got really cross-sectoral approach regarding the cooperation between industries. Ajit Pai is a friend of mine, you know Ajit as well, and we spent a couple of hours talking about the differences between Europe and US. Of course, there are some, let's say, differences regarding the spectrum, regarding the infrastructure release, but what is the biggest, let's say, the biggest difference is that we are still sectoral, and the, let's say, US market is cross-sectoral, and that's the biggest difference right now. That's what we need to overcome in future, I guess, in Europe. I hope that the code will bring us much closer to that, but who knows, as you mentioned, it's quite challenging and difficult even to understand what we need to deliver in 2 years' time.
Thank you for drawing the attention on how innovative the US has been on the spectrum front. They've pioneered something called incentive auctions, where basically when telcos wants to kick out other users of the spectrum of a band, basically the proceeds of the auctions are going towards paying for the move, if you like. So essentially, the 600 band, was used by broadcasters, and sort of there is a mechanism in the auction to discover the prices at which broadcasters would be happy to vacant the band and sort of use more efficient technologies in lower bands. Maybe you should use that with the Soviet military, no?
Yeah.
That would be another. Just a quick comment on the FCC not having to report to Brussels and UKE and others having to do it. This is, I think, my own view on that, and I can imagine that for a national regulator like you, it must sometimes be frustrating, but as an observer of the telecom scene, this is one of the great achievements, I think, of EU law. Because I remember in the 90s, too often, telecom regulators were taking this decision in smoke-filled rooms behind closed doors. In other words, one morning you would discover in the official journal, there was not yet any website in those days, a decision from the regulator, and you had no idea what was the process that. So what things like Article 7 and other things have achieved is forcing in every country the regulator to be more transparent, not just vis-à-vis the European Commission, vis-à-vis people in the room here, vis-à-vis their own national stakeholders. by having to report to Brussels, basically, that doesn't really matter that they have to report to Brussels. The key thing that it achieves, it is to report, it is to be transparent vis-à-vis its own stakeholders. At least that's I think, personally, that I can see why you could feel someday a bit different about it, but I think it has been.
No, we are transparent as well, because we've got the BEREC Stakeholder Forum, so that's the one platform for us. But on the national level, for example, in Poland, we've got really strong, let's say, really strong and close-knit community, if you know what I mean. Everyone knows each other. We've got 4 chambers, and for example, for me as a regulator, it would be a disaster and harmful, even fatal, if I decided to, let's say, announce anything without the, let's say, confirmation that more than 50% of the market is for, not against. Of course, there are some tensions regarding the way we use SOS to, and the tolls we impose on operators to achieve our goals, but let's say the final goals are indisputable. So that's how it works. Of course, with over 3,500 telco providers in Poland, active providers, we are not able to guarantee the level playing field for all of them, but we want to guarantee the same level of awareness of our goals and, let's say, to receive the feedback and the outcome about their expectations. That's quite unusual situation in Europe, but in Poland it's purely Pareto rule, 3,500 telco providers, and in the same time, the pure Pareto rule, 20% of market players generate over 80% of the market value. So you need to confirm with this 20% that your, let's say, approach, that your focus and vision is in line with the market expectations.
Marcin, back to what we discussed earlier, the targets in terms of connectivity. An issue that keeps coming back, and I've never heard the definitive answer on that, is 5G versus FTTH. I say FTTH for FTTX. Yeah? So in other words, very high capacity fixed networks versus 5G. And a comment that you hear regularly is, government needs to decide. Either they want 5G or they want FTTH, but these two services are competing, so you cannot have both. Then you speak to OECD. OECD, they are diplomats, and so they say, "Oh, Philippe, no, they are complementary. If you want 5G, you need fiber." So you see, there is no problem. That's a bit simple, I think, is an explanation. So what do you make of that?
So there should be a substitution, as OECD believes, between fixed and mobile, but it sounds nice in theory. Sometimes it doesn't work in practice, especially when you need to, let's say, compromise with your values. In many countries, as I mentioned this morning, Poland is a good example in Europe because we use EU funds and purely fixed infrastructure to deliver broadband to the, let's say, widest of the wide gaps in which there is no appropriate incentives for investments. But if you combine that with the, let's say, South Africa or even Oceania countries, that the strong, huge amount of money is delivered to for infrastructure rollouts, it's obvious that you need to compromise your values. So there are areas where, let's say, fixed fiber optic access would be never achievable for the end user in terms of infrastructure as well as in terms of price. So the mobile is the only solution. I would even make a one step further for those areas when there is no space for mobile activity. The satellite infrastructure is the only solution for connectivity. In Europe, in Poland, we do not recognize this problem in this way because we do not have a problem with the, let's say, substitution in this way that, for example, for those areas when the fix is not available, mobile operators with the penetration skyrocketing above 140%, they would deliver what it needs to be delivered. But for the other continents, for example, if you combine that with the reports delivered by European Commission, with the Broadband Commission, it's not how it works. So the satellites is the only solution to find and to guarantee a basic level of connectivity.
on the business case for 5G, since let's stick with mobile for a minute. As you just said, every country, has its own prospects has its own business cases will vary from country to country. In Poland, how do you see the demand being sort of triggered for 5G? Will it first be the consumer market? Will it first be the industrial market? Will it first be, you mentioned transport being an important vertical where it will be a bit of everything, but where do we see, when you speak to, I mean, of course the regulator, it's not the job of the regulator to second guess the market, but when you speak to operators, where do they see primarily the business case? Is it?
Well, I think that it's not how it's really organized, because it's not the question between B2C and B2B, but the general question about how to guarantee the, let's say, the inappropriate payback from this investment. And of course, we did this homework just before the spectrum distribution. As you supposedly know, last Friday we decided to announce the auction for the C-band, 8 times 80 megahertz, and we've got 4 market players that we expect to fully cover this for with the infrastructure. If I had been asked, let's say, 3 years ago, I would have said that it doesn't matter. Right now, what's going on in Europe, not only the coronavirus problem that block a little bit the, let's say, the transfer of devices, the problem with the play between supply and demand that is coming to Europe right now. I think that the biggest challenge is to make both ends meet. You need to impose an obligations in terms of, let's say, budget expectations. I mean, the starting price, for example. You need to combine that with the coverage obligations. I don't want to go through the discussions regarding the question, is the starting price let's say, announced by the regulator is an appropriate one or the best one. Of course, from the operator's point of view, it should be free of charge. From the government point of view, it should be sold with the, let's say, the highest amount that it's reachable in national conditions. But from my perspective, the most important issue is, as I mentioned, no one wants to buy a Mercedes without wheels. And you need to take into consideration that, first of all, there are some disadvantages in the infrastructure rollout that you need to take into consideration. There is the macroeconomic problem right now coming to Poland. There is the macroeconomic problem stemming from the coronavirus issue as well. There are some tensions regarding the Chinese and European, let's say, providers delivering infrastructure. And we took all those conditions into consideration, having in mind that the most important issue is the consumer expectations and what follows from that, the coverage obligations that somehow, to some extent, I need to underline that, to some extent should be imposed.
We need to talk about consumers in a minute. But since you mentioned nobody would buy a Mercedes without wheels, it makes me think of Germany. And we just heard a very good presentation by a representative of
one has already bought, and that's
German.
the problem right now in Germany.
And in connection with the C-band, the 3.5 gigahertz band, the German is an interesting case study. You all know the story. There was a good lobbying from the German industry to say we need our own 5G because we're not sure that operators will be able to meet our needs. And basically, the regulator assigned 100 megahertz in the C-band not for mobile operators, but for Mercedes, for BMW, for BASF, whoever, wants to roll out 5G in their factories. Now that, as you know, the rest of the story, this combined with 4 operators bidding for the 300 megahertz left, that sort of send the auction to some very high level. Is it still do you think it's still a good idea? Would you, for example, in Poland, is it something that was discussed? Do you see a case for that, or should we rather do like other countries do it, assign everything to mobile operators and then have a use it or lease it arrangement?
Well, that was the question I faced with several times just before the auction announcement, and necessity is the mother of invention. We've got several providers, current existing providers in C-band that we need to guarantee, let's say, safe and secure activity. They are using EU funds. They are delivering some, let's say, services, social services as well. So that's what follows from that. I don't want to say that it's a feeble excuse not to deliver for time 100 megahertz, but I believe that there is so many issues that are in front of us in terms of spectrum. You know, you didn't mention that this German approach was completely against the Commission expectations, because Commission expects regulators to deliver as much spectrum to the commercial business, to the commercial industry as it's as possible. But I believe that you need to release some Wi-Fi bandwidth for future. I didn't have this privilege to inherit such kind of scenario from my my predecessors, because they were completely different reality. We successfully supported WiMAX solutions. We successfully supported, let's say, broadcasting in 700 megahertz, and now we need to reshuffle these providers and digital terrestrial television to the lower bandwidth. But when it comes to C-band, I believe that is a compromise not only with the current providers, but also with the, let's say, future expectations that would sooner or later would come from the industry. There are more and more solutions, and we are sometimes, as a regulator, we are asked by our international colleagues, I mean international entrepreneurs, about the C-band for future, and the final feedback is that they don't need mobile operators for that. They can deliver the solutions with spectrum without the commercial launch on the let's say national level, which is normally delivered by the mobile operators. So there are more and more business models that supposedly would be a little bit aside the pure mobile market in the future, and that's why it's really crucial not to, let's say, make this kind of final decision right now, but to wait, to hold on a little bit for future.
Marcin, a topic I'd like to allude to is CO2 emission. I mean, neither of us are expert of CO2 emission and green stuff, but to echo Jaroslav's great presentation, I thought, this morning, I'd like to ask the following question, which perhaps yourself discussed with your friends over the weekend. So there is this perhaps greenwashing from our friends, the manufacturers, saying, you know, 5G is greener than 4G, and they explain you the fantastic efficiency gain that manufacturers have achieved to reduce the amount of energy needed to carry a bit of data. So that's the good news. Now, of course, I'm sure you had this over barbecues at the weekend. Your friends are quick to say, yeah, you say you're more efficient, but at the same time, you're going to carry many more bits and bytes that you didn't buy. So we have a more efficient networks, that's true, but at the same time, you provide capabilities whereby you are going to encourage consumption. So what is the score on that? What is your, I'm sure some of you have had the same, you know, I find myself in a difficult position trying to defend my industry, but what do you make of that, Marcin?
Well, I'm not a green guy because I use diesel engine, and I believe that it's still the best solution for me personally, but you are right, and you know, I'm not widely experienced in these green issues regarding the let's say health issues let's say connected with the industry, and the only knowledge I I'm collecting his fraud from the, let's say, state-of-the-art, some solutions that are available, combining some telco branch and, as I mentioned, energy, for example, or logistics. But from my perspective, of course, sooner or later we will come back to, we will face the problem of, let's say, replacing some labor power with the remotely controlled solutions. Of course, the exponential growth of data is really crucial issue, and I do not connect the environmental issues with the growth of data usage. I believe that we can still make both ends meet. But what is really important is that whatever it is, the problem of, let's say, environment, the problem of healthy issue like with, let's say, the density of base stations or the others, the final message from the Europe Broadband Commission is that apart from the collaboration, there is a need for, let's say, common understanding of the needs between the branches, because the synergy and the mergers between telco, energy, logistics, sooner or later will come, and I don't want anyone to be surprised with that.
No, absolutely, I very much share that view. Hello, two things. The first one is, I cannot see, well, now I can see you if I do this. Are there any, I've got plenty of other questions, but if there is a burning question in the audience, please let me know. Huh? And then another thing, perhaps Lydia or somebody can tell me, I see, is it the time that I've got left there, 8 minutes? Yes, if not, let me know. Huh? Otherwise, Marcin, it's again perhaps not a question strictly related to regulation, although regulation can perhaps accompany that movement, but something that perhaps doesn't surprise me, because I've been expecting it for a long time, but which we have seen in a big way in the last few months, is a different kind of investor arriving in telecom. You know, the name of the game whenever we talk about FTTH 5G is investment gap. Huh? My personal belief, it's not so much an investment gap than a demand gap, an absence of business case, you know. And of course, quite rightly, the CEO or the CFO of a telco, if he doesn't see a clear business case, he tries to delay its capex. Huh? That makes sense. But at this, what we have seen, and that's what I would like us to focus on for a minute, is private equity money, pension funds, if you want to use another words, investing into the passive parts of networks. You know, I wrote them down here. You know, recently in Spain, Macquarie is an Australian pension fund. They used to own the airport in Brussels, for example. You know, they bought the passive network, fiber to the home network of MásMóvil, you know, a large Spanish operator. Morgan Stanley has just bought a 50% stake in what is actually Portugal Telecom fiber network. KKR, which is this huge private equity firm that well known, just bought part of the copper line network of Telecom Italia and is going to upgrade it to fiber in 10 years. And I could, you know, you've got Deutsche Glasfaser in the US, you've got, anyway, various, I'll stop there. But they seem to me that all of a sudden, something is changing in the paradigm, and the name of the game before was telcos must be vertically integrated, and now all of a sudden, we've seen it with mobile. In mobile, you have this trend around the world for mobile operators to sell their towers to tower companies like Connex in Europe or American Towers and so on. And are we seeing this on the fixed side as well? You know, this is a big change that would be a big change of paradigm, or is it just a few isolated examples?
It affects two I mean, fixed as well as mobile industry. You mentioned about the American tower that did extremely huge homework in Poland as well. Last year, they were thinking about the investments in Poland. Of course, it's a commercial part of the market, so I'm not aware what's going on right now. But you know, I think that in Poland, it's not the case of, it's not the problem of funds, because we've got EU funds, over 1 billion euros to deliver for additional 10% of households. We've got operators ready to use spectrum, and I think that is the problem of, it's not the problem of capex, it's the problem of costs. I mean, the cost of activity in Poland. Of course, many years ago, all 4 mobile network operators delivered, let's say, separate infrastructure for the national coverage. Right now, it's not how it works in Europe, and apart from, let's say, HR processes, the best option to limit the, let's say, operational cost is to, let's say, outsource the infrastructure. So that's what's going on in Europe, and of course, in Poland, we've got the first solutions on the wholesale market. We've got carriers strictly interested in wholesale market. I mean, Nexera or even Inea, who is this operator thinks seriously about, let's say, leaving B2C market and starting the core activity on the B2B one. But that's the answer to the question regarding the fixed infrastructure, because it's happening. But I'm curious about what will happen in nearest future in terms of mobile infrastructure. We've got one alliance that was made several years ago, and it's the cooperation between Orange and T-Mobile in terms of somehow passive infrastructure. But I think that it's a general approach that some operators are seriously taking into consideration for future. So you need to outsource if you want to satisfy your stakeholders, especially in front of such huge, let's say, capex for the further, investments regarding 5G or regarding fiber optics. It's still, let's say, more than 50%, as Dorian said, and that should be connected around the world.
Yes. To perhaps talk about another change of paradigm is to talk about strategic autonomy. So basically, for people who are as old as me in the room, there are probably not so many, but we have lived all our lives in a world that was becoming more pro-free trade, more free circulation of goods, services, ideas. We were all friends, you know. Since the end of the Cold War, we were friends around the world. And what we noticed, I mean, we can regret it and so on, but that's a fact of life. We seem to be entering now a new wave of increased nationalism, and whether it's the effect of the growth of China, whether it's the effect of Trump, whatever, it doesn't matter. We live in a world where nationalism is on the rise. And in our little sector of connectivity, but more broadly in the economy, there are increasingly talks about strategic autonomy. You know, is it right to rely on Chinese equipment and American operating system, and should we not, in Europe, become more resilient, you know, so that we can avoid the equivalent of the coronavirus, but in ICT terms, you know. This is, of course, a question well above my pay grade, perhaps also above yours, Marcin. This is very much strategic decision at the level of our governments. But, you know, as experts of the system, what can we say in terms of what is realistic? You know, can we do can we imagine a life in the short run without Intel chips and Huawei 5G base station? I mean, is it realistic?
So you smoothly switched to the political issues from the telco market, and I take this challenge.
I'm asking all the questions I always dreamed to ask you.
Somehow you need to be a politician as well. I'm trying to do my best not to become a politician and to be far away from the political decision-making process, which does not mean that this process does not affect me in my operational activity. Rather than nationalism, I really admire neoclassical economy, and I believe that there is no need to instruct the private entrepreneurs how they should organize their business. It's not the, let's say, the most important white-collar clerk's responsibility. When you ask me about the which is better, the infrastructure, the national infrastructure managed by, for example, government, and the private one, of course, the play between supply and demand is organized in this way that it should be the private one. So, as for example, as Stigler or the other economists said. On the other hand, there are some, let's say, core national interests that should be addressed, like, for example, cybersecurity, like some, let's say, other threats regarding the military issues as well. And from my perspective, that should be addressed. But does it mean that we need to deliver the national operator, or we need to, let's say, guarantee some other tools to fulfill the governmental expectations? We will see. We are just before the, let's say, this kind of discussion on the national level as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I think competition in markets would probably go somewhere into addressing that question of the strategic autonomy. On that, I think our time is up. I would have loved to ask you the other 20 questions I had prepared. But please join me in thanking Marcin for having answered my question so honestly.
Please join me in thanking Philippe for coming to Warsaw in this quite difficult time. So thanks a lot.